Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to take a closer look at a word that gets used as if its meaning is obvious, but I'm not sure it's quite that simple. Storytelling is a word I've been hearing constantly at shows, judging commentary, and in podcast conversations. It's given as praise, sometimes as a category, and increasingly as a measure and indicator of quality. The storytelling in this work is great. This miniature really tells a story. The term appears so frequently and with such confidence that it has started to feel almost self-evident. Of course, a good miniature tells a story. Of course, storytelling enhances a piece. And yet, the more I hear the word used in these different contexts, the less certain I am that we are all referring to the same perceptual experience when we use the term. That uncertainty is what prompted this episode. I'm not interested in arguing against storytelling. Miniatures have always contained narrative in some capacity. Even the most basic object on a base can suggest time, action, and context. There is no magic formula or number of figures on a base that defines whether a piece is telling a story or not. What I want to explore is how storytelling functions in the minds of viewers, and whether we have enabled the term to become so broad that it no longer distinguishes between different kinds of viewer engagement. Storytelling can have many meanings. It can indicate a clear and defined sequence of events. It can refer to atmosphere or mood. It can imply the history of an object. It can shape the emotional tone of a scene. It can even refer to the viewer's imagination when filling in what could occur in the scene. Those are not equivalent processes. When we equate those processes as interchangeable, we risk flattening significant differentiation into a single approval-based label. To illustrate this point, it helps to slow down and consider the experience of viewing a miniature. Imagine standing in front of a small diorama. A single infantry figure leans slightly forward, his boots are caked with mud, a broken fence post is next to him. Before you read a title or description, your mind has already started working. You infer what may have just happened, you predict what might happen next, you attribute emotional tone to the physical stance of the soldier. You construct temporal context around a static image. Research in event segmentation suggests that human perception automatically divides scenes into meaningful segments or episodes. Even when presented with a single still scene, we often impose a before and after. We construct continuity and we assume causal relationships. Now, imagine reading the title beside the piece moments before reinforcements arrive. The title has clarified that the soldier is not alone. He's part of a larger unit moving forward beyond the view of the piece. The moment depicted in the piece is not one of after effects, but rather one of anticipation. Your emotional interpretation of the piece has shifted. At that point, your interpretation narrows to a more specific sequence of events. The story has become more specific and your uncertainty has decreased. You may need that additional clarity. Clarity is really important in historical modeling. Clarity is helpful in competitive environments when evaluating a piece of art can be difficult. But perceptually, the experience has changed. The viewer's role has shifted from constructing possibilities to recognizing a declared one. Neither process is better than the other. They are different forms of engagement. And that difference is what I want to explore further. Visual artists have long understood that static images often work best when they capture what art theory has called a pregnant moment, a single instant that implies both what came before it and what may occur after it. Miniatures operate in the same way. They display a fragment of time, and the viewer reconstructs the larger sequence of events. As I began to think about this concept, I realized the question overlaps with something I explored in the previous episode. In that discussion, I was looking at why some technically perfect miniatures can still feel strangely inert. The problem there was not skill, it was that everything in the piece had already resolved visually. Storytelling can create a similar dynamic. When the narrative is completely specified, the viewer's interpretive work can conclude just as quickly as visual discovery does. In both instances, the underlying question is the same. How much of the experience should be completed by the artist, and how much should remain active in the viewer's mind? If we pause for a moment on that shift from constructing possibility to recognizing a declared sequence, I want to clarify what we mean by the word story when we use it in art. At its most basic, storytelling means that a viewer perceives a moment as part of a sequence. Something has happened, something is happening, or something is about to happen. In miniature art, that sequence is usually compressed into a single, frozen instant, and the viewer reconstructs the rest. What becomes clear pretty quickly is that storytelling is not just one thing. When someone says that a piece tells a strong story, they may be responding to the clarity of the event. They may be responding to the emotional readability of the figures. And they may be responding to atmosphere or implied history, or possibly the way the work encouraged them to imagine beyond the physical boundaries of the base. All of these are valid responses. What I find interesting is how imprecisely we often talk about narrative in miniature art. Once a term becomes flexible enough to include multiple perceptual mechanisms, it can begin to function more as approval than analysis. Miniature art has evolved significantly in its technical execution. The level of painting, sculpting, and environmental design we see today would have seemed extraordinary a few decades ago. With advancements in technique, communities begin to look for new factors of distinction. Narrative depth, conceptual framing, and emotional resonance become more prominent criteria to help establish the quality of a piece. That trend is understandable, and it may even signal progress. But when storytelling becomes one of the primary markers of depth, it becomes important to understand what kind of storytelling we are recognizing. One way to think more clearly about storytelling is to separate the different perceptual processes that often get grouped together under that word. For my own understanding, I've found it useful to think in terms of three modes: not as categories for judging and not as a hierarchy for measuring the quality of art. They exist as distinct ways in which a piece of art can engage the viewer's mind in terms of narrative. The first is what many people mean when they speak about storytelling in miniature art. It's narrative in the classical sense, identifiable actors, a discernible cause and effect relationship, and a recognizable segment of time within a larger sequence of events. A soldier firing at an unseen opponent, a medic crouched over a wounded figure. The viewer can easily determine what happened immediately before and what is likely to follow. In its simplest form, a story involves someone or something acting, events unfolding through time, and some form of change. Something happens because something else happened. The viewer recognizes this structure almost immediately. There is nothing simplistic about this form. In historical modeling especially, clarity can be essential. A scene that represents a specific documented event may require precision to avoid misinterpretation. In competitive settings, legible sequence can make evaluation more straightforward. Clarity can also represent real artistic and practical purposes in terms of storytelling. This type of storytelling can also fixate the viewer's interpretation of the sequence. Once the viewer has recognized the causal progression of events and resolved the implied sequence, the process of construction is replaced with the process of confirmation. The second mode of storytelling works differently. Rather than presenting explicit action, it relies on atmosphere and remnants of activity. Imagine a ruined street without figures, a tank overtaken by rust and vegetation. There may be no visible event taking place, yet the viewer still perceives a narrative. In this situation, the viewer's brain creates a story based on the physical evidence of the environment, rather than the depiction of the actual event. We respond to texture, decay, arrangement, and absence. Research in event perception shows that humans are highly sensitive to indicators of change in an environment. We do not need to observe the action itself to imagine the circumstances that led to the event. This form of storytelling operates through implication. It may slow interpretation slightly because the causal chain is not explicitly depicted, but it still guides the viewer towards a coherent narrative direction. The third mode is discussed less frequently. In this mode, the piece provides cues but deliberately withholds resolution. The emotional state of a figure may be ambiguous. The outcome of an action may be unclear. The scene may contain tension without specifying its source of conclusion. Imagine a child seated on the floor beside a broken toy. The toy is clearly damaged. The child is looking down. But is this grief, guilt, relief? Did the child break it or find it that way? The sequence is there. The interpretation is open. In this scenario, the viewer does not passively infer a sequence of events. The viewer actively participates in creating meaning. The mind continues generating hypotheses because the scene does not resolve into a single authoritative interpretation. Perceptually, this mode keeps the viewer in a more active state of attention. The process of interpretation is slower since the viewer has not reduced uncertainty to a point of closure. Again, I want to emphasize these are three modes of storytelling, not a hierarchy. One is not better than the other, but what they do is produce different cognitive experiences for the viewer. When we use the word storytelling without acknowledging the differences between these three modes, we risk elevating one form of engagement without recognizing that we are doing so. What makes this especially relevant for miniature artists is that research specific to dioramas supports the idea that narrative does not function only as plot. Discussions about dioramas have often drawn a distinction between depicting an event and constructing a full narrative. Shepard Payne, writing about military and historical dioramas, described them as representations of moments in action rather than complete literary stories. That distinction is subtle but important. Showing a moment of activity is not the same as building a fully developed story arc. In other words, the medium itself may be structurally closer to suspended moments than to fully developed narrative arcs. That observation alone complicates the assumption that more explicit storytelling automatically equals greater depth. If these modes of storytelling produce different forms of engagement, it is useful to consider whether research in perception and aesthetics supports the distinctions. There is research in aesthetics that looks at how viewers respond to works of art. Researchers investigate how complexity, ambiguity, coherence, and familiarity affect attention and interpretation. While miniature art is rarely the subject of formal laboratory experiments, the underlying perceptual mechanisms are not medium-specific. One common finding in this research is that moderate openness, or what some describe as structured ambiguity, can increase viewer participation. This does not imply a lack of order or chaos. Instead, it indicates situations in which a work provides enough structure to invite interpretation, but not sufficient to cause interpretation to conclude immediately. The psychologist Helmut Leder and his colleagues proposed a model of aesthetic appreciation, suggesting that viewers actively interpret what they see. According to this model, they try to organize and make sense of the work in front of them. When interpretation is too effortless, the process ends quickly. When it's impossible, frustration interrupts engagement. But when the work presents a level of uncertainty that remains manageable, the viewer will continue to interpret the work. There is also research on the Zeigarnik effect, originally observed in studies of memory for uncompleted tasks. The broader principle suggests that incomplete or unresolved states often remain cognitively active longer. Although this effect has been studied in many contexts, the underlying idea is relevant here. When something feels unresolved, the mind continues returning to it. If we relate this to miniature art, we can begin to see why different storytelling modes might produce different perceptual responses. A clearly defined narrative may resolve quickly and satisfy the viewer's expectation for sequence. An atmospheric scene may prolong interpretation by requiring reconstruction from fragments. A participatory piece may sustain engagement longer because it does not fully close the interpretive loop. None of this implies that explicit narrative is superficial or that ambiguity is inherently superior. It simply suggests that cognitive dynamics differ and that the word storytelling may be describing more than one perceptual process, depending on the work you're viewing. If moderate ambiguity facilitates sustained interpretive effort, then the question becomes whether that effort changes how a piece endures in the mind. Engagement in the moment is one thing. How long the memory of that experience lasts is another thing. Empirical aestheticists have observed that works which resist immediate resolution often produce longer viewing times and in some cases greater memorability. The mechanism is not especially mysterious. When a piece requires active interpretation, the viewer spends more mental energy on it, and that can make it more memorable. This connects to the Zeigarnik effect I mentioned earlier, the idea that incomplete patterns remain mentally active. The mind revisits what has not been fully closed. Applied to miniature art, this suggests something worth considering. Which pieces do we find ourselves thinking about days after a show? Sometimes it is the most technically accomplished piece. Sometimes it is the most dramatic narrative scene. But often it's the piece that left a small gap, the one that didn't fully specify how we were meant to feel and interpret it. An expression that could be interpreted in more than one way. A scene that implies a history without explicitly stating it. These pieces do not necessarily shout their story. They allow it to remain slightly open. And when something feels active, the mind tends to return to it. Again, this is not an argument that ambiguity is superior. It's the idea that ambiguity changes a temporal dimension of engagement. If storytelling becomes synonymous with explicit narrative closure, we may unintentionally give the advantage to immediacy over duration of engagement. That is a subtle distinction, but it's important. Depth in art is often less about immediate comprehension and more about sustained presence. Visitor response studies in museum contexts offer an interesting parallel. Research observing how people interact with natural history dioramas suggests that engagement often unfolds in stages. Viewers first identify what they're looking at, then they interpret relationships within the scene. Only after that do they begin to imagine beyond the frame, asking questions or constructing implied sequences. In other words, narrative construction is frequently the result of viewer activity rather than something fully embedded in the object. That finding aligns closely with the idea that structured openness does not diminish engagement, it redistributes it. Ideas like these are interesting in theory, but they become more meaningful if they appear in real work. When I think about how storytelling functions in miniature art, I'll use one of my own pieces as an example. My box diorama Algorithm as Art was not built to dramatize a literal event, but it contains strong narrative cues. A mechanical arm is painting its AI-generated artwork on a deteriorating wall. Severed heads of historical artists lie on the floor. A large robotic shadow stretches across the interior space, its claw extended, while discarded AI-generated art lies nearby on the floor. There are actors in this scene. There is implied causality. Something has happened. Something may be happening. What is not specified is the moral conclusion. Is the machine creating, replacing, eliminating? Is this satire? Is it a warning? Inevitable progression? The scene does not declare its moral stance. It presents evidence and allows the viewer to decide how to interpret it. When people encountered this piece, they did not struggle to identify what they were looking at. The elements are clear, the symbolism is deliberate, but interpretation diverged quickly. Some saw it as commentary on artificial intelligence, displacing and stealing from artists. Others read it as critique of fear surrounding technology. Some even saw dark humor in it, and others saw threat. What interested me was not disagreement, it was persistence. People returned to it. They discussed it. The narrative did not close immediately. Perceptually, this is important. The scene provides structured cues. It establishes agency and tension, but it does not resolve intention. That unresolved layer keeps interpretive processing active. This is not vagueness. Vagueness would lack anchors. This piece contains anchors. What remains open is evaluation. In cognitive terms, the viewer is not constructing a sequence of events from scratch. The sequence is implied. What remains active is the assignment of meaning. That difference matters. Algorithm as art does not avoid storytelling. It demonstrates that narrative clarity and interpretive closure are not the same thing. The agents are present and the tension is visible. What remains unsettled is judgment, and that unsettled layer is where engagement continues. There may also be a broader reason that storytelling has become such a prominent term in recent years. Miniature painting and sculpting have progressed at a remarkable pace. Online instruction, high-resolution photography, social media visibility, and global exchange between artists has helped to raise this technical baseline. What once distinguished a handful of elite painters is now more widely achievable through shared knowledge and practice. When technical excellence rises across a community, attention often expands toward concept, narrative framing, or emotional resonance. If many artists can achieve a high level of quality, distinction often begins to happen in other areas. That shift can reflect a desire to expand the creative possibilities of the medium. Storytelling may be functioning in that way within miniature art. But whenever a new criterion for evaluation becomes important, clarity about its meaning becomes more important, not less. Are we recognizing clarity of historical sequence, emotional immediacy, conceptual provocation, viewer participation? Without that distinction, the word risks stretching to cover everything from explicit reconstruction to abstract suggestion. Elastic terminology does not necessarily improve standards. Over time, it can make them harder to define. Miniature art has reached a level of maturity where the precision of definitions can be important. The work being created is complex and nuanced. The conversation around it should be equally nuanced. If storytelling becomes one of the most frequently cited measures of depth, even in casual conversation, it begins to exert subtle influence on creative decisions. This influence does not even have to be intentional. No one needs to declare that narrative clarity is superior. It is enough for the language of praise to repeat certain patterns. When miniature artists consistently hear that strong storytelling distinguishes exceptional work, they can begin to anticipate what that might mean in terms of their creative choices. Does it mean clearer action, more obvious emotional expression, more clearly staged scenes? Maybe it manifests itself in more detailed backstory in titles or descriptions. Over time, vocabulary can narrow what feels safe to build. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A builder is developing a piece that hinges on emotional ambiguity. The expression of the central figure is intentionally difficult to categorize. The gesture could be restraint or hesitation. The surrounding environment implies context, but does not declare it. As the piece nears completion, the builder begins thinking ahead to show presentation. Will the ambiguity be understood? Will the judges interpret the uncertainty as intentional or as a lack of clarity? Would a short explanatory paragraph help ensure that the narrative reads correctly? These are reasonable considerations. They are not signs of insecurity. They reflect awareness of context, but they also reveal how vocabulary shapes decisions. If storytelling is primarily associated with clear narrative sequence, then ambiguity begins to feel like risk. Not artistic risk in the dramatic sense, but evaluative risk, and risk can alter behavior. Over time, if clarity is consistently rewarded more visibly than participatory openness, artists may lean toward resolution. This does not require any formal rule change. It happens gradually through shared language. The important point is not that storytelling categories exist or that there is anything wrong with them. The point is that when a term becomes central, its meaning should be treated with care. Otherwise, what began as an expansion of evaluation criteria can unfortunately become a new constraint. That constraint may not be visible at first. It may even feel like progress. Ambiguity can become harder to articulate within the language of storytelling, and that would be a loss of range, not an increase in depth. Let's return to that infantry figure for a moment because examples help clarify theory. Before you read the title, you had already begun to build a story around that infantryman. Your mind interpreted him to be exhausted after a battle, isolated. These interpretations came from his posture, his environment, and his lack of equipment. When the title specified that reinforcements were arriving, the interpretive field narrowed. The story shifted from loss to anticipation. The emotional tone changed. Now imagine three slightly different versions of that same piece. In the first version, the title is explicit. The description explains the exact historical context, the regiment involved, the documented moment being depicted. The posture and environment are calibrated to reinforce that narrative precisely. This is narrative clarity in its strongest form. The viewer's task is recognition and contextual understanding. In the second version, the title is minimal. Perhaps it simply names the location. There is no explanatory paragraph. The environmental cues suggest aftermath but do not specify outcome. The viewer reconstructs the probable sequence from available visual details. This is atmospheric storytelling. The narrative is implied rather than declared. In the third version, the expression of the figure is ambiguous. The posture could indicate exhaustion or resolve or something more complex. The broken fence post could signal retreat or advance. The title offers no guidance beyond a single word. Here the viewer must decide not only what happened, but what the moment means. All three pieces could be executed at the same technical level. All three could be historically accurate. All three images could be characterized as compelling storytelling. However, they would each produce different experiences for the viewer. The first resolves quickly and satisfies clarity. The second invites reconstruction. The third sustains interpretive tension. When we reduce these different experiences to a single category of approval, we oversimplify something much broader and more complex. If clarity is more easily recognized and described, it may receive more immediate affirmation. Participatory ambiguity, by contrast, may require longer viewing time to be appreciated fully. And what is rewarded visibly tends to shape what is attempted repeatedly. This is not a claim that the community consciously prefers one form. It's an observation about how language interacts with attention. The difference between narrative clarity and participatory engagement is not a difference of quality. It's a difference of cognitive structure. If miniature art has evolved to a stage at which storytelling is cited as one of the most significant aspects of the medium's depth, then it has also reached a stage at which the term deserves examination. Maturity in any medium is not only technical, it's also conceptual and linguistic. It involves the ability to describe what you are doing with clarity. It involves distinguishing mechanisms rather than compressing them into general approval. For many years, miniature art has fought to be taken seriously outside its immediate circles. Technical skills were the primary proof of seriousness. Precision of brushwork, fidelity to scale, mastery of material, these were all the markers of advancement. Now that technical excellence is widely visible and widely achievable, the conversation has expanded. Narrative, atmosphere, concept, and emotional resonance are part of the discourse. That expansion is healthy, but with expansion comes responsibility. If we're going to speak about storytelling as a measure of depth, then we should be prepared to articulate what kind of storytelling we mean. We should be able to distinguish between clarity of sequence and openness of interpretation, between declared narrative and participatory engagement. Otherwise, we risk confusing resolution with depth. Returning to the earlier example, the infantry figure does not become more meaningful simply because its narrative is specified, nor does it become more meaningful simply because it remains ambiguous. Meaning arises from how the viewer interacts with the cues provided. The question then is not whether a miniature tells a story. Almost all of them do in some sense. The question is how that story functions. Does it invite recognition? Does it invite reconstruction? Does it invite participation? Each of those modes has value. Each can be intentional. Each can be executed with discipline, but they're not identical. Maybe the word is carrying too many experiences at once. What matters is not that every story concludes neatly or remains ambiguous. What matters is that we recognize the difference between clarity and participation, between declared narrative and interpretive space, and acknowledge the difference. As an artistic medium evolves, its language should evolve along with it, because storytelling isn't one thing. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist, subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.